I want to preface this by saying I'm not someone who believes in anything. I grew up in a house where my dad called astrology expensive stupidity, and my mom kept a first aid kit where other people kept Bibles. I studied computer science at Oregon State, spent 3 years writing back-end code for a logistics startup that collapsed under its own mediocrity, and then went freelance. I track my calories in a spreadsheet. I have a drawer specifically for cable management. I am, by any reasonable measure, a boring, rational person who has never in his 31 years on this earth believed in anything that couldn't be measured, tested, or at minimum Googled. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe is not the product of an overactive imagination or too much ambient stress or the particular way that sleep deprivation can make the brain turn on itself like a dog in a too small crate. I'm telling you this because I was skeptical right up until the moment I couldn't be anymore, and by then it was already too late to matter. My name is Mark Calloway. I've lived in Portland, Oregon since September of 2021, in a building called Ashford Court on the corner of Northwest 23rd and Lovejoy, which is one of those streets that sounds more charming than it actually is. The building is a 5-story brick thing from the 1940s with an elevator that sounds like a man clearing his throat and hallways that smell permanently of old carpet and someone's lavender fabric softener. My apartment is 3B. 3rd floor, middle of the building, 2 windows facing the street, one facing a narrow gap between buildings where pigeons congregate with the grim persistence of commuters. The rent is $1,200 a month, which in Portland is either reasonable or a crime depending on which year you're asking. I moved in because it was close to my then-girlfriend Maya's place on Glisson, and I stayed after she left because moving is expensive and I had already figured out which of the 2 grocery stores within walking distance had the better produce section. The Whole Foods on Burnside, for the record. Worth the extra walk. I work from home. This is relevant because it means I'm in the apartment most of the day, and it means that the rhythms of the building become part of your own rhythm whether you want them to or not. You learn which radiator pipes clank at what hour. You learn which neighbor gets up early to run and which one has loud phone calls in a language you don't recognize. You learn the sound of the elevator at different times of day. After 2 years in 3B, I knew Ashford Court the way you know a body you've lived in long enough, not consciously, but in your bones. The noise started maybe 3 weeks after I moved in. October 2021, right around the time the rain came back in earnest and the days started closing up early like flowers going to sleep. I remember waking up the first night and lying in the dark trying to identify it. It was footsteps. That was the simplest and most accurate description. Heavy footsteps from the apartment directly above mine, which would be 4B, moving with slow, deliberate regularity from one end of the space to the other, corner to corner, back and forth. Not the casual, interrupted movement of someone getting water at 2 a.m. or padding to the bathroom. Steady. Rhythmic. Patient. The steps were heavy enough that I could feel the faintest vibration in my mattress if I held still, like a second pulse running under my own. I checked the time on my phone that first night, 2:17 a.m. I noted it the way I note everything, automatically, the way my brain files away data it doesn't know what to do with yet. Then I put the pillow over my head and went back to sleep. It happened the next night. And the night after that. By the end of the first week I had checked the time enough times to confirm that it always started around 2:15 a.m., give or take a few minutes. Sometimes 2:13. Once, memorably, 2:19. But always in that window, always the same sound, always that slow, heavy back and forth that I eventually started thinking of as a metronome. That's actually how I started referring to it in my head, the metronome. Capital M. The way you give a nickname to something annoying that you've decided to make peace with rather than fight. In those early weeks I did what any reasonable person does. I told myself it was an old building with thin floors and an eccentric upstairs neighbor who happened to be a night owl and happened to pace. Lots of people pace. I pace myself when I'm on a long call and need to think. The metronome was just some insomniac up there working something out in his head, wearing out a circuit in the floorboards the way you wear out a path in a lawn. Nothing mysterious. Nothing worth getting upset about. I actually laughed the first time I saw my upstairs neighbor, maybe 2 weeks after the noise started. I was coming back from the Whole Foods with a canvas bag full of groceries and he was in the lobby checking his mail. Older man, late 60s at least, wearing a cardigan the color of old mustard and holding a piece of mail at arm's length the way people do when they've given up on reading glasses. White hair, very fine, the kind that looks like it would blow away in a strong wind. He had the careful, deliberate walk of someone who'd had a hip replacement and wasn't entirely sure it had taken. He introduced himself as Gerald Henderson and shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone who looked like a strong draft might knock him over. We talked for maybe 3 minutes in the lobby, about the rain, about the building's temperamental heating system, about nothing in particular, and he was pleasant, a little distracted, the kind of neighbor who exists in a building the way furniture exists in a room. Present. Inoffensive. Unremarkable. I walked back to my apartment smiling to myself. The metronome had a face now, a cardigan, an arm's-length relationship with his own mail. Gerald Henderson, insomniac pacer. Mystery solved. I put away my groceries, made pasta, watched half an episode of something I can no longer remember, and went to bed at 11 feeling the comfortable smugness of a man who has explained away a thing that briefly concerned him. The noise came at 2:15 as always and I slept through most of it, which at that point I'd gotten good at. The metronome was just background now. White noise with footsteps. That's how it stayed for most of the next 2 years. I'm not exaggerating when I say 2 years. I built a life in that apartment, got used to the creak of the third stair on my floor and the sound of the couple in 3A arguing in low, urgent voices on Sunday evenings and the metronome every single night at 2:15. I got a cat named Ptolemy from a rescue in St. John's who turned out to have opinions about everything and no respect for anyone's schedule. I started a project with a Berlin-based company building data pipeline architecture that kept me busy and relatively solvent. I dated someone for 4 months, a woman named Caroline who was a nutritionist and had very strong feelings about seed oils, and then didn't date anyone for a while. I learned to make my grandmother's chili recipe. I rearranged my home office twice trying to get the lighting right for video calls. Life, in other words. The normal accumulation of it. Through all of that, the metronome. Every night. 2:15 a.m. Back and forth above my head, heavy and steady and patient. I'd stopped hearing it consciously the way you stop hearing traffic when you've lived near a busy street long enough. It was just Gerald up there, working something out. The first thing that snagged my attention, not alarmed me, just snagged, the way a loose thread catches, was something I noticed on a Wednesday in March 2023. I was up late, really late, finishing a deliverable for the Berlin project, and I'd hit the kind of silence that only happens around 3 a.m. when even the city seems to hold its breath. No cars on Lovejoy. No wind. Ptolemy asleep in his corner. The apartment was so quiet I could hear my own keyboard clicks echoing off the walls. And in that quiet, the metronome was louder than I'd ever heard it. That was the thing. Not that it had changed in any identifiable way, but that the silence made it present in a way I wasn't used to. I sat back from my laptop and listened to it for the first time in probably a year, really listened, and it struck me that the sound was different in complete silence than it was under the usual ambient noise of a lived-in night. It sounded heavier. More deliberate. The gaps between steps were absolutely consistent, I timed them almost without meaning to, the data brain doing what it does, roughly 4 seconds between each step. 4 seconds there. A pause at the wall. 4 seconds back. A pause. 4 seconds there. Like something being very, very careful about a routine. I told myself I was tired and overthinking and went to bed. Which was true. I was tired. And I was probably overthinking. But I noticed after that. I noticed the way you notice a thing once you've actually looked at it, which is that you can't stop noticing it. The metronome was loud when the apartment was quiet, and it was quiet when there was other noise, and the pattern was so consistent that it almost seemed like it was aware of when I was listening. Which is exactly the kind of thought a tired, slightly lonely person at 3 a.m. has about ambient building sounds, I told myself. Brain looking for patterns in noise. Pareidolia of the ears. I left it alone for another few weeks. Then came the night with the rain. It was early April, one of those Pacific Northwest rains that doesn't perform or announce itself but simply commits, a steady, serious downpour that started around midnight and settled in like it had paid for the week. I'd gone to bed late again, around 1:30, and was reading on my phone in the dark with Ptolemy asleep on my feet like a small, opinionated anchor. The rain on the windows was heavy enough to almost mask everything else. Almost. At 2:15, the metronome started. I registered it the way I always registered it, a blip of awareness that didn't even fully surface, and was most of the way back to sleep when I felt something on my face. Cold. A drop. I blinked at the ceiling in the dark, and a second drop landed on my cheek. I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. There was a dark stain spreading across the ceiling directly above the bed, maybe 2 feet wide, irregular at the edges. Even as I watched it, another drop gathered at the lowest point and fell. I moved the lamp closer, squinting at it. The color was wrong. Rain coming through a ceiling leak is usually yellowish or brown, the color of old plaster and minerals. This was darker. More the color of rust, or of something else I didn't want to name at 2:17 in the morning. I put a bowl under the drip, took a photo of the stain for the building management email I was already composing in my head, and lay back down to wait it out, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. The metronome kept going above me, steady and patient, and I couldn't help noticing, that it didn't change. Not in rhythm, not in weight. The steps continued without any break or hesitation. If someone upstairs had a leak of any significance, they would have encountered it. A wet spot on the floor, a drip somewhere in their space. You'd stop. You'd deal with it. Anyone would break their 2 a.m. circuit to handle an active water leak. The metronome didn't break for a single step. I lay there listening to it and watching the shadow the lamp threw across the ceiling and feeling something shift in the quality of my thinking about this. Not fear, not yet. More like the moment when a math problem that seemed straightforward suddenly reveals a variable you hadn't accounted for. The slight adjustment of the mind that comes before understanding. The dark liquid dripped into the bowl. The metronome paced above. The rain covered both sounds and then didn't, and I lay in the gap between sleep and waking thinking about how Gerald Henderson, in his mustard cardigan, would have stopped walking if there was water on his floor. Anyone would stop. I cleaned up in the morning, sent the email with photos, got a response from building management saying they'd have maintenance take a look. The stain dried to a rusty shadow on the ceiling that the maintenance man, a quiet Guatemalan guy named Oscar who smelled like cigarettes and WD-40, looked at for a long time before saying he'd need to get back to me about it. He said the stain was consistent with a leak from above, but when he knocked on the ceiling it sounded wrong. He used that word. Wrong. Then he seemed to catch himself and said he meant it sounded like the insulation up there might be wet, and he'd put in a report. Nothing happened after that. The report apparently went somewhere bureaucratic and stayed there. The stain remained on my ceiling like a bruise. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in mid-April, I hit my limit. I don't know why that particular night was the one. The noise wasn't any louder, the hour wasn't any more inconvenient than the hundreds of previous 2:15 a.m.s I'd survived. But I was staring at the ceiling listening to those patient, heavy steps and thinking about the dark drip and Oscar's expression when he'd knocked and said wrong, and something in me just solidified. I was going upstairs. For the first time in the 2 years I'd lived in 3B, I was going to knock on the door of 4B and have a direct human conversation with Gerald Henderson about the noise and the leak and the general situation. This decision felt good. Rational. Proactive. I put on sweatpants and a t-shirt and went out into my hallway, which at 2:30 in the morning was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of how much sound you personally generate just by existing. The elevator was at the bottom and I didn't want to wake anyone with it, so I took the stairs, which smelled like carpet and a faint chemical undertone I'd never been able to identify. 3rd floor to 4th floor. 1 flight. The 4th floor hallway stopped me. I can explain the physical sensation I had when I stepped off the stairs into the 4th floor corridor, but I can't fully explain why it hit me as hard as it did. It wasn't that the hallway was dramatically different from mine. It was subtler than that. The carpet was the same, the slightly greenish overhead lighting was the same, the apartment doors were spaced at the same intervals, 4A on the left, and then on the right, where 4B should have been, where in my building's floor plan and in my own mental map of the building 4B unquestionably existed, a wall. Not a door with a wall on either side. A wall where the door should have been. Floor to ceiling, end to end, as if the opening had never been there. The same brick as the rest of the corridor, but different. I stood in the hallway and looked at it and understood that the difference was newness. The brick and mortar in that section were slightly lighter than the surrounding wall, the way a patch repair is always a different shade than what it's joining. It had the look of work done carefully but recently enough that the aging hadn't caught up with it yet. There was dust on the surface, a thin even layer, the kind that takes more than a week to accumulate. I touched it. The mortar between the bricks was solid. Not painted over, not covered with a panel, actual brick and mortar, laid and dried and waiting to be forgotten. I went back downstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the rusty shadow on my ceiling for a long time. In the morning I found Gordon Grayson, the building's superintendent, in his office on the ground floor. Grayson was a heavy-set man in his early 60s who wore the same type of short-sleeved collared shirt regardless of weather and kept a mounted fish above his desk that I suspected he'd inherited from whoever had the office before him. We'd spoken maybe 6 times in 2 years, always briefly, always about maintenance requests. He was the kind of man who communicated entirely in the verbal equivalent of form letters. I told him I'd been up on the 4th floor and I'd noticed the wall where 4B's door should be and I wanted to understand what I was looking at. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the mounted fish. Then he told me. There had been a family in 4B. He didn't give me their name and I didn't push for it, not then. A family, he didn't elaborate on the composition, just said a family, who had lived there for several years before what he called an incident. Before the incident there had been a fire, small but with significant smoke damage, and during or around the fire was when the incident happened. He was not going to tell me what the incident was, and the way he said this communicated that the incident was not something he was going to be maneuvered into describing regardless of how long I sat in his chair across from him. The building's owner, a property management company out of Seattle that I'd dealt with exactly once, over a lease renewal, had made the decision to seal the apartment rather than renovate it. No contractor would work in the space. That was how Grayson put it, flat and factual, like a code violation rather than an explanation. No contractor would work in the space, so the decision was made to seal it and move on. I asked when this happened. He told me 2 years ago. Roughly 2 years ago, this past October. I sat with that for a moment. October 2021. I had moved into 3B in September 2021. The metronome had started 3 weeks after I moved in, which would have been October. I asked Grayson if the apartment had been occupied when the incident happened, or if it had been empty. He stood up. The conversation was over. I went back to my apartment and sat at my desk and didn't open my laptop. Ptolemy jumped up and put his front paws on my arm and looked at me with the calm, omniscient expression he deployed when he wanted food and also, apparently, when I had just learned something that was reorganizing the architecture of the last 2 years. I scratched his ears and thought about Gerald Henderson, who I had spoken to in the lobby and who I had mentally assigned to the sounds above my bedroom for 700-odd nights. Gerald Henderson, who I had seen checking his mail in the lobby, whose handshake I remembered, whose cardigan I remembered. Gerald Henderson, who lived in 4B. Where 4B had been sealed for 2 years. I spent 2 days trying to build alternative explanations the way you build a model, piece by piece, testing each joint to see if it would hold weight. Maybe there were 2 buildings on this block with a similar layout and I'd confused the address when I saw Grayson about the unit. Maybe there were 2 floors with a similar configuration. Maybe I'd seen Henderson in a different building entirely and my brain, in the casual and unreliable way that brains link people to contexts, had slotted him into Ashford Court. Maybe there was a 4B accessible from a different stairwell. Maybe the wall was part of a renovation and the unit had simply moved or been renumbered. Maybe Grayson was confused about the timeline. I tested each one. I walked every corridor in the building. I checked the building directory in the lobby, which showed 4B as vacant, had shown it as vacant so long that someone had taken the nameplate card out of the slot. I checked old photos on my phone from when I'd first moved in, looking for anything in the background that might tell me something, and found, in a photo from late October 2021 of Ptolemy as a kitten sitting next to a grocery bag, the corner of the 4th floor hallway visible through my open apartment door as I propped it for moving things in. The photo was blurry at the edges, the way phone cameras sacrifice focus at the margins, but I could see enough. The hallway behind the door. And there, where the wall now was, the dark rectangle of a door. The door had been there in October 2021. By the time I'd confirmed this I'd been awake for the better part of 2 days, surviving on coffee and the particular cold alertness that comes when your brain has decided sleep is a luxury it can't currently afford. My hands weren't shaking but they felt like they wanted to. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and my photo and the full weight of the thing sitting on my chest, thinking about a sealed room 2 floors above me, thinking about what Grayson had not said when I'd asked him about the family. The metronome came that night at 2:15 as always. And for the first time, I couldn't unhear it. It wasn't background anymore. It was foreground, heavy and deliberate and patient, filling the bedroom the way water fills a container, finding every corner. I lay on my back and listened to it with the specific attention I've been applying for the last 2 days to everything connected to 4B, and I tried to think about pipes and structural settling and the particular way old buildings redistribute sound and came up empty, because the sound had feet. It had weight, and the weight had a pace, and the pace had a personality, and I had been living below that personality for 2 years and calling it Gerald Henderson. I got up and pressed my ear to the ceiling. This was a stupid thing to do. I knew it was stupid while I was doing it. I stood on my desk chair, which was not designed for standing on, and pressed the side of my head against the textured plaster of the ceiling and listened. The steps were clearer up close. Not dramatically louder, but cleaner, the way headphones clarify the elements of a piece of music that speakers blend together. I could hear, and this is where I want you to understand that I am a data scientist who does not hallucinate patterns without a significant evidence base. I could hear something between the steps. Underneath them. A sound that was rhythmic in its own way, slower than the footsteps, the sound of breath moving through a constricted passage, ragged at the edges, the way breath sounds when someone is very old or very damaged or both. And under that, fainter, requiring the total commitment of attention to register at all, something scraping. The sound of something hard and narrow, the corner of a nail, the tip of a finger, drawn slowly across concrete. I stood on the chair with my cheek against the ceiling and listened to these 3 sounds layered on top of each other: steps, breath, scraping, and then the steps stopped. Directly above where I was standing. They stopped and I felt, rather than heard, the particular quality of stillness that means weight settling, a body pausing. And then 3 knocks came through the ceiling. Not loud. Deliberate. Evenly spaced, the same interval, 3 beats that I felt in my jaw and my sternum and some part of my nervous system that exists below language. 3 knocks that were exactly the rhythm my heart was making against my ribs in that moment. I fell off the chair. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light in the apartment on and drank water because I'd had so much coffee there was no point, and held Ptolemy, who allowed this with his usual air of tolerating the emotional needs of a lesser species. When the sun came up I felt neither better nor worse, only operational, the way you feel when you've moved past fear into whatever is on the other side of it. I bought a hammer at the hardware store on Burnside. I told myself this was just to confirm the obvious, to do what should have been done immediately when I found the sealed wall, establish that the geometry of the building was what I thought it was and that the space I was hearing the sounds from was simply the structural gap between my ceiling and whatever floor existed above it. I was going to make a small hole, small, the size of a fist, and look through it and see insulation and joists and wiring in the underside of the 4B subfloor, because that was what was there. That was what had always been there. And then I was going to go to sleep for approximately 1 million years. I stood on the desk chair again, in the bedroom, in the spot directly below where the steps had stopped the night before, above the rusty stain that had long since dried but not faded. The metronome wouldn't come for hours. It was mid-afternoon, gray and drizzling, and the building had that particular afternoon quiet around it that empty weekdays always have. I held the hammer and looked at the ceiling. My first strike knocked loose a chunk of plaster the size of my hand. The second opened a gap. The third pulled a ragged section away entirely and left a hole roughly 8 inches across, and through it I felt air, cold, stale air, the smell of something closed for a long time, old smoke, and something beneath that, something biological, something that had been sealed in and gone through changes in the dark. I coughed against it and blinked and trained the flashlight from my phone on the opening. I was ready for insulation and joists. What I saw instead was space. An actual room's worth of space, the gap between my ceiling and the opening much larger than any structural cavity would be, the flashlight beam extending up and out into darkness that receded further than physics should have allowed. A floor somewhere up there. The underside of real floorboards. The remnants of what might have been a rug. I tilted the light and looked through the hole and saw shoes. Not a shadow of shoes. Not a suggestion. Shoes, old leather work boots, dark brown and worn at the toe, thick-soled and heavy, the kind of boots designed for something that required weight and endurance. Standing on the floor directly above the hole, the toes of the boots pointing toward me, perfectly still. Inches above my head. I could see the creasing of the leather at the ankles, the worn-down edge of the sole heel, the dark staining that comes with years of use. Still. Completely still. I don't know how long I stood there on the chair with the phone light pointed up through the hole and the cold dead air of the sealed apartment on my face and the boots not moving. Long enough that my arms started to shake. Long enough that Ptolemy came into the bedroom and then turned around and left again, which he has never done when I'm standing in a room. And then the boots moved. 1 step. Away from the hole. Then another. And the metronome started again, for 47 in the afternoon, 2.5 hours ahead of schedule, back and forth across the floor of the sealed room above me, back and forth, heavy and patient and completely, utterly indifferent to the fact that it had been standing directly above a hole made by a man who was trying to prove it didn't exist. I got off the chair. I went to the kitchen. I sat on the floor with my back against the refrigerator because the refrigerator was humming and the vibration was something real and solid and mechanical, something I understood. Ptolemy came and sat on my feet. The metronome went back and forth above me through the ceiling. And then I heard something else. From behind me. From the living room. From inside the apartment. A step. Heavy. Deliberate. The same weight, the same cadence, translated now from above to level, from ceiling to floor, the metronome no longer a thing I listened up toward but something that existed in the same horizontal plane as my body, in the space I lived in, between the couch and the bookshelf where I kept novels I never finished and the lamp Maya had left because it didn't fit in her car. One step. Then another. Then the slow, creaking patience of back and forth. I did not look. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator and Ptolemy on my feet and my eyes on the middle distance of the kitchen cabinets, and I listened to the footsteps moving through my living room. The same sound I'd been sleeping below for 2 years, now in the room next door. Slower, maybe. Or maybe I was just hearing each step with the absolute clarity of someone who has moved entirely past denial. After a while the steps stopped. I couldn't tell you how long it was. My phone said 6:22 when I finally looked at it, which meant nearly an hour and a half had passed since I'd started making the hole. Silence from the living room. The refrigerator humming against my back. Ptolemy asleep on my feet. From the hole in the bedroom ceiling, slowly, almost gently, like something being offered rather than dropped, a length of hair. White, very fine, the kind that would blow away in a strong wind. It descended through the opening and hung there in the cold air coming up from the sealed room, and it was still hanging there when I grabbed Ptolemy and my car keys and my laptop bag and left the apartment without looking at the living room. That was 11 days ago. I'm at my sister's place in Beaverton. She thinks I'm having a breakdown, which is a reasonable interpretation of events. I've told her the building had a mold problem. She believes me, mostly because I haven't told her anything else, and also because I've always been the practical one and she has no framework for me sitting on her couch at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling. I haven't gone back to get the rest of my things. I've emailed building management about breaking my lease and listed asbestos as the reason. I don't know what they'll do with the apartment. I don't know what Oscar will find when maintenance eventually goes up there. I've been thinking a lot about Gerald Henderson. The man I met in the lobby with the firm handshake and the arm's-length relationship with his mail. The cardigan the color of old mustard. He was pleasant. He was real. I can still feel the pressure of his grip. I've looked up every combination of fire, incident, and the Ashford Court building address that I can find online, and found nothing. Whatever happened in 4B 2 years ago, it didn't make the news, or if it did, it's buried somewhere I can't reach. I check the time a lot. I don't sleep well. My sister's ceiling is smooth white plaster and the building is new construction and there is nothing above her bedroom but sky, and I know this, and I still lie there at 2:15 in the morning and listen. Last night, just before 3, I heard something in the hallway outside her guest room. One step. Just one. And then nothing. Ptolemy didn't move from my feet. That's the part one can't stop thinking about. He always moves.